You have felt it. Not sadness. Sadness is clean. Sadness has a reason. Sadness points at something specific and says, "This is why I hurt." Sadness is a response to a real thing that happened, and when the real thing fades, sadness fades with it. This is different. This is the thing that arrives without knocking, without reason, without the courtesy of an explanation that would at least give you something to argue with. It settles into the chest like wet concrete, and it does not explain itself, and it does not respond to logic, and it does not care that your life is, by any objective measure, fine. It just sits there, heavy, grey, patient. And the worst part is not the feeling itself. The worst part is the thought that comes with it. The thought that says, something is wrong with you specifically. That other people do not feel this. That there is a version of being human that does not include this weight. And you have somehow been excluded from it. And the exclusion is permanent. And it is your fault. Here is what that thought gets wrong. Every single part of it. Because this feeling, this exact feeling, the heaviness without cause, the grey weight in the chest, the sense of being cut off from the world by a barrier you cannot see or name or explain to anyone who has not felt it themselves, is not a modern invention. It is not a product of social media, or processed food, or sedentary lifestyles, or the particular pressures of contemporary existence. It is as old as the human mind itself. People felt it in ancient Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago. They felt it in classical Greece. They felt it in medieval Europe. They felt it in Tang Dynasty China. They felt it in every era, in every culture, in every civilization that has ever existed. And they did not have the word depression, and they did not have therapists or medication or the entire apparatus of modern mental health care. And they dealt with it anyway. Not perfectly, not always successfully, not with the sophistication that modern neuroscience has given us, but with something. And some of what they used was wrong, based on theories about demons and bile and divine punishment that we have long since abandoned. And some of what they used was right, genuinely, verifiably, scientifically right, confirmed by modern research centuries or millennia after the fact, discovered not through clinical trials, but through the slow, patient accumulation of human observation across thousands of years of people watching other people hurt and asking, what helps? What actually helps? This is the story of those answers, the wrong ones and the right ones, the ones that came from superstition and the ones that came from wisdom so deep it looked like superstition until modern science caught up with it. The story of how human beings, before they had any of the tools we consider essential for understanding the mind, managed to identify some of the most effective interventions for mental suffering that we still use today. Not because they were primitive, because they were paying attention for a very long time. Before you can treat something, you have to name it. This sounds obvious. It is not obvious. It is one of the most profound and consequential acts that a human being or a human culture can perform. The name you give to a thing determines what kind of thing it is. It determines where it lives in your understanding of the world. It determines who is responsible for it, what causes it, and, most importantly, what you are supposed to do about it. Name something a spiritual affliction, and you send the sufferer to a priest. Name something a medical condition, and you send them to a physician. Name something a moral failing, and you send them to no one, because moral failings are the sufferer's own responsibility to overcome through will and virtue and the application of sufficient personal effort. The name is not just a label. The name is a diagnosis, a cause, a treatment plan, and a social response, all compressed into a single word. So what did ancient people call the thing we call depression? The Mesopotamians, who built the first cities and developed the first writing system and left us the first detailed records of human psychological suffering, called it something that translates roughly as being seized by a demon. This sounds, from a modern perspective, like pure superstition, like the primitive response of people who did not understand the brain and filled their ignorance with supernatural explanations. But look more carefully at what the name actually does. It locates the cause outside the sufferer. The demon is not you. The demon is something that has happened to you, something that has attached itself to you from outside, something that is distinct from your essential self, and that is, therefore, potentially removable. You are not broken. You are afflicted. You are not the problem. You have a problem. This distinction matters enormously. Modern research on depression consistently shows that one of the most damaging aspects of the condition is the way it turns against the self. The tendency to interpret the symptoms of the illness as evidence of personal inadequacy. The heaviness is not a symptom, it is proof. Proof that you are weak or lazy or fundamentally defective in some way that other people are not. The Mesopotamian framework short-circuited this self-attack. Of course you feel terrible. You have a demon. The demon is making you feel terrible. It is not you. It is the demon. The demon can be addressed, negotiated with, expelled through the appropriate rituals performed by the appropriate specialists. There is something to treat. There is someone who can help. You are not alone with this. These three things, the existence of something treatable, the existence of someone qualified to help, and the removal of the sufferer from isolation into a social response, are not primitive superstitions dressed up in modern language. They are, according to contemporary research on what actually helps people recover from depressive episodes, among the most important elements of effective treatment. The Mesopotamians got the mechanism wrong. They got the structure right. The ancient Egyptians had a different name. They spoke of a heaviness of the heart, a phrase that is physically precise in a way that is almost startling. Not the mind, not the soul, the heart, the organ that they considered the seat of consciousness and emotion, the physical center of the person. The heaviness of the heart was understood as a real physical phenomenon, not a metaphor. The heart had become heavy with something some accumulation of spiritual weight that pressed it down and made it sluggish and prevented it from functioning as a heart should function. This is interesting because modern research has established genuine connections between depression and cardiovascular function. The heart actually does behave differently in people experiencing severe depressive episodes. Heart rate variability changes. The cardiovascular system becomes measurably less responsive. The ancient Egyptians did not know the mechanisms, but their description of the symptom, a heaviness in the chest that was both emotional and physical, maps onto something that modern medicine has confirmed is real. They were describing something accurate, in language that their understanding of the body made available to them. The Greeks, who gave us so much of the vocabulary of Western medicine, gave us the word that dominated thinking about depression for nearly 2,000 years: melancholia. From melas, meaning black, and chole, meaning bile. Black bile. We have met black bile before, in the context of cancer, where it was also blamed for a different kind of suffering. The humoral system was a unified theory of everything that went wrong with the human body and mind, and black bile was its explanation for the darkest experiences. Melancholia, in the Hippocratic framework, was a physical illness, not a spiritual one, not a moral one. A medical condition caused by an excess of a specific bodily fluid that accumulated in the brain and the heart and produced characteristic symptoms. The symptoms that Hippocrates, and later Galen, described for melancholia are recognizable to anyone who has studied modern diagnostic criteria for depression. Persistent sadness without apparent cause, loss of interest in activities that previously brought pleasure, disruption of sleep, either too much or too little, loss of appetite, fatigue that was not explained by physical exertion, withdrawal from social engagement, persistent fear and despondency. This list, written 2,500 years ago, is not significantly different from the diagnostic criteria in the current edition of the Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual. Hippocrates was not guessing. He was observing, carefully, systematically, over a career of watching hundreds of patients experience the same constellation of symptoms. He was mapping a real phenomenon with real consistency. The theoretical framework he used to explain it, black bile, was wrong. But the phenomenon he was mapping was real, and his map of its symptoms was accurate enough to be recognizable today. The Chinese medical tradition used a different framework entirely, but arrived at similar observations through a different path. Traditional Chinese medicine understood psychological suffering in terms of qi, the vital energy that flows through the body along specific pathways. Depression in this framework was understood as stagnant qi, energy that had stopped flowing, that had pooled and thickened and lost its animating quality. The image is different from the Greek one, but the underlying description is similar. Something that should be moving has stopped moving. Something that should be dynamic has become static. The cure, logically, was to get the energy moving again. This led to treatments involving acupuncture, physical movement, herbal preparations designed to stimulate circulation, and specific breathing exercises intended to restart the flow of stagnant energy. Some of these treatments had no effect. Some of them, particularly the physical movement and the breathing exercises, were effective in ways that modern research has confirmed, because aerobic exercise and controlled breathing both have measurable effects on the neurochemistry associated with mood regulation. The Chinese physicians were right about the movement. They were wrong about the qi. And this is the pattern that repeats across every ancient culture's approach to what we call depression. Wrong explanation, right observation. Wrong theory, right intuition. The name they gave to the suffering shaped the treatment they offered, and the treatment, filtered through centuries of observation and refinement, sometimes arrived at something genuinely useful, even when the reasoning behind it was entirely incorrect. The name mattered. The name always matters, because the name is where the healing begins, or where it fails before it starts. In ancient Greece, if you were suffering from what we would call depression, there was a place you could go. Not a physician's house, not a temple where a priest would pray over you and send you home. A specific kind of place, designed specifically for healing, that combined elements of what we would today recognize as a hospital, a spa, a therapy center, and a theater, all in one location. It was called an Asclepion. Named after Asclepius, the god of medicine, these healing centers were built across the Greek world, from mainland Greece to the islands to the coast of modern Turkey. The most famous was at Epidaurus, and it was so successful that people traveled hundreds of miles to reach it, which in the ancient world was not a casual journey. You did not travel hundreds of miles unless you believed, with genuine conviction, that what waited at the end of the journey was worth the cost. What waited at Epidaurus was a process, and the process is worth examining in detail because it contains, embedded within its religious and ritualistic framework, a sophisticated understanding of what suffering people actually need, that modern psychology spent most of the 20th century rediscovering. The process began before you arrived. The journey itself was considered part of the treatment. The act of leaving your ordinary life, your house and your work, and the daily environment that had become associated with your suffering, and moving through the world toward a place dedicated to healing, was understood to begin the healing before any formal treatment had occurred. Modern therapists call this a change of context. The removal of a person from the environmental cues associated with their depressive state reduces the automatic triggering of depressive responses. The ancient Greeks called it pilgrimage. The mechanism is the same. When you arrived at the Asclepion, you were not immediately treated. You were prepared. The preparation involved ritual purification, bathing in specific waters, dietary changes, periods of quiet and reflection. You were asked to leave behind, symbolically and practically, the life you had been living. You fasted, you prayed, you spent time in the sacred precinct, absorbing its atmosphere, its architecture designed specifically to produce feelings of calm and awe, its natural setting chosen for beauty and tranquility. You were being, in modern language, detoxed from your ordinary life, stripped of the habits and patterns and environmental triggers that had become part of your suffering, made ready to receive something different. Then came the incubation. You slept in the sacred space. The Greek word for this practice was enkoimesis, sleeping within. You lay down in the abaton, the sacred sleeping hall, and you waited for a dream. Not just any dream, a dream sent by Asclepius himself, a dream that would contain either a direct cure or a symbolic message that the temple priests would help you interpret. The dreams were taken with absolute seriousness. They were recorded, analyzed, discussed between the dreamer and the temple priests in sessions that look, from a sufficient distance, remarkably like what we would today call therapy. The dreamer described the dream in detail. The priest asked questions. The meaning was explored, not imposed from outside, but drawn out through dialogue, through the dreamer's own associations and responses, and the slow emergence of personal significance from symbolic material. Carl Jung, who developed his theory of dream analysis in the 20th century, and is considered one of the founders of modern psychotherapy, was explicitly aware of the Asclepian tradition. He was not reinventing something new, he was recovering something ancient. The questions the temple priests asked the dreamers at Epidaurus 2,000 years before Jung were not significantly different from the questions a Jungian analyst asks a client today. What did you see? What did it feel like? What does this image mean to you? What does this figure remind you of in your own life? But the Asclepian offered something that modern therapy often cannot. It offered community. You were not the only sufferer at Epidaurus. You were one of many. All of you engaged in the same process. All of you there for the same reason. All of you stripped of your ordinary social roles and placed in a context where suffering was not shameful, but expected. Not a private failure, but a shared human experience that the place was designed to address. The other pilgrims were part of the treatment. You talked to each other. You shared your dreams. You witnessed each other's processes. You were, perhaps for the first time in your experience of your suffering, surrounded by people who understood, not because you had explained it to them, but because they were living it themselves. Modern group therapy is considered one of the most effective interventions for depression. The Greeks invented it at Epidaurus. They just called it something else. And then there was the theatre. Epidaurus had a theatre. One of the best preserved ancient theatres in the world, in fact, famous for its acoustics so perfect that a coin dropped on the stage can be heard in the back row. It was not separate from the healing complex. It was part of it. Theatre was considered a component of treatment, as medically relevant as the sacred baths or the dream incubation. Aristotle wrote about this directly. He used the word catharsis to describe what theatre did to its audience. The word means purging or cleansing. Tragedy, in Aristotle's analysis, purged the audience of the emotions that were causing them suffering by giving those emotions a safe container in which to be fully experienced and then released. You sat in the theatre and watched characters experience grief and fear and despair and rage on a scale that dwarfed your own private suffering. You felt those emotions vicariously. You wept. You were afraid. You were moved in ways that your ordinary, defended, daily self could not afford to be moved. And then the play ended, and you were still there. And the emotions that had felt too large and too dangerous to experience directly had been experienced through the safe distance of fiction, and you had survived them. And survival proved something. It proved that the emotions were survivable, that the grief would not actually destroy you, that the fear was not actually infinite, that you were larger than what you were feeling. This is the mechanism of narrative therapy, of psychodrama, of every therapeutic approach that uses story and character and the safe distance of fiction to allow people to approach emotional material they cannot approach directly. Aristotle described it in the 4th century BC. Modern drama therapy rediscovered it in the 1970s. The Asclepian had it built into its architecture from the beginning. The healing complex and the theatre were not separate facilities that happened to share a location. They were one system. Sleep and dream and talk and witness and weep and be moved and emerge changed. That was the treatment. That was the whole treatment. And it worked. Not for everyone, not perfectly, not in every case. But the Asclepians remained in operation for nearly 1,000 years, which is longer than any modern psychiatric hospital has existed, and people kept travelling hundreds of miles to reach them, which means the reputation for effectiveness was sustained across centuries and generations, and the testimonies of thousands of people who had made the journey and returned changed. Something was working, and what was working was not the supernatural element. It was everything surrounding it: the journey, the community, the ritual preparation, the serious attention paid to inner experience, the safe container for overwhelming emotion, the therapist priests who listened without judgment, the other sufferers who witnessed without shame. The God was the frame. The healing was human. It was always human. Not every ancient answer was right. We should say this clearly and without apology before we continue, because the story of how ancient people dealt with what we call depression is not a story of continuous wisdom and hidden genius. It is a story of humanity at its most human, which means it contains genuine insight and terrible error in roughly equal measure, often held simultaneously by the same people in the same tradition. The Greeks who built Epidaurus also believed that melancholia in women was caused by the uterus wandering through the body and pressing on the heart. The Egyptians who described the heaviness of the heart with such precise empathy also believed that certain mental states were caused by the dead, specifically by the spirits of people who had died unhappy and were expressing their unhappiness by inhabiting the bodies of the living. The Mesopotamians who designed rituals that inadvertently incorporated genuine therapeutic elements also believed that sufferers had been specifically targeted by demons as punishment for moral transgressions, which meant that before you could treat the demon, you had to identify the sin, which meant that the sufferer was required to search their past for the thing they had done wrong that had brought this affliction upon them. This last practice is worth pausing on, because it sounds, on the surface, like a straightforward case of blaming the victim. And it was that, partially. The requirement to identify personal moral failure as the cause of suffering added a layer of shame to an experience that was already characterized by self-blame and worthlessness. But it also did something else, something that is recognized in modern cognitive therapy as genuinely useful. It required the sufferer to review their life systematically, to think carefully about their relationships, their decisions, their patterns of behavior, their history, to examine themselves, not casually, but with serious, sustained attention, in the context of a supportive ritual structure, in the presence of a specialist whose role was to help them make sense of what they found. The goal was wrong. They were looking for sin. But the process of systematic self-examination, guided by a specialist, in a structured context, produced something that looked a great deal like what modern therapists call insight. The wrong goal sometimes produced the right outcome. This is deeply uncomfortable if you want the history of mental health treatment to be a clean story of progress from ignorance to enlightenment. It is not that story. It is messier and more interesting than that story. But the medieval period is where the darkness became most concentrated. The dominant framework for understanding severe psychological suffering in medieval Europe was demonic possession, not as a metaphor, not as a poetic way of describing the experience of being overwhelmed by forces that felt external to the self, though it was that too, and the metaphor was accurate in ways that the people using it did not fully intend. As a literal, physical, theologically serious explanation. The demon was real. It had entered the person's body through a specific point of vulnerability, a moment of spiritual weakness or moral failure or simple bad luck, and it was now operating the person's mind and body from the inside, producing the symptoms of what we would recognize as severe depression or psychosis, or any of a range of serious mental conditions. The treatment, logically, was exorcism. The process of exorcism varied in its specifics across time and geography, but its core structure was consistent. A specialist, a priest or exorcist with the appropriate training and authority, confronted the demon directly through prayer, ritual, and the invocation of divine power, and commanded it to leave. Some people improved after exorcism. This is documented. It is not easy to explain away, and it would be intellectually dishonest to try. The most likely explanation involves several mechanisms that modern psychology understands well. The first is the placebo effect, which is not a dismissal, but a genuine and powerful phenomenon. If you believe deeply that a treatment will work, the belief itself produces measurable neurobiological changes that can alleviate symptoms. The faith of the medieval sufferer in the power of exorcism was absolute and sincere, and that faith activated real processes in the brain. The second is the social element. Exorcism was a public ritual. The sufferer was the center of serious community attention. They were not ignored or dismissed or told that their suffering was not real. They were taken seriously. Their condition was acknowledged as real and significant. The community gathered around them. The most respected specialist available was called to help. For someone who had been suffering in isolation, feeling cut off from the world by the invisible barrier of their depression, this sudden influx of serious community attention was itself therapeutic. The third mechanism is the narrative. Exorcism gave the sufferer a story about their own experience that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. You were afflicted. You were treated. The affliction was removed. You were restored. This narrative arc, from suffering through intervention to recovery, is not just psychologically satisfying in a vague sense. It is structurally important. Modern research on trauma and depression consistently shows that the ability to construct a coherent narrative about one's experience, to place it in a story with causes and progression and resolution, is one of the most important factors in recovery. Exorcism provided exactly this narrative for those it helped. For those it did not help, the consequences could be severe. When the first exorcism did not work, the explanation was that the demon was particularly powerful or particularly entrenched. The solution was more intensive treatment. This could escalate in ways that caused real harm, not because the practitioners were cruel, but because they were operating within a framework that interpreted continued suffering as evidence of continued demonic presence, requiring more forceful intervention. The practitioners believed they were helping. They were not always helping. This is perhaps the most important lesson in the entire history of mental health treatment. Good intentions plus wrong framework equals harm. Not always, not inevitably, but often enough that the framework matters as much as the intention. A person who genuinely wants to help you, but who fundamentally misunderstands the nature of your suffering, can make your suffering worse, while remaining completely convinced that they are making it better. This was true in the medieval period, with demonic possession frameworks. It has been true in the modern period, with frameworks that also turned out to be wrong in ways that were not recognized until after the harm was done. The history of mental health treatment is not a story of evil people doing terrible things to vulnerable ones. It is a story of well-meaning people operating within flawed frameworks, and occasionally, despite the flawed frameworks, stumbling onto something that actually helped. And of the people who were suffering, finding ways to survive even inside the systems that were failing them. Because people who are suffering are not passive. They have never been passive. They look for what helps. They find it in unexpected places. They find it in the friendships that form between people who share a condition, in the private rituals they develop independently of official treatment, in the moments of beauty that break through the grey weight without warning or explanation, in the work that absorbs them fully enough that the demon, as they called it, loses its grip for a few hours. They find it in the same places that people find it today, because the finding is human, and the human part has not changed. Hippocrates had a patient. We do not know his name. We know almost nothing about him as an individual, except that he came to Hippocrates suffering from what the physician described as prolonged fear and despondency without apparent cause, an inability to sleep, a loss of appetite, a heaviness that made every day feel like walking through water. Hippocrates examined him, and then he did something that a modern psychiatrist, equipped with the entire pharmacological arsenal of contemporary medicine, might also do. He told him to walk. Not as a casual suggestion, not as a polite afterthought after the real treatment had been prescribed, as a primary intervention, as the thing most likely to help, as the treatment that Hippocrates, based on decades of observing what actually worked in patients with this constellation of symptoms, believed had the best chance of moving the black bile that had accumulated in the brain and the heart and was pressing down on the person's capacity for joy. The mechanism he proposed was wrong. The prescription was right. We know this now with a precision that Hippocrates could not have imagined. Aerobic exercise, the kind produced by sustained walking, produces measurable changes in the neurochemistry associated with mood. It increases the availability of serotonin and dopamine, the neurotransmitters that modern antidepressant medications are designed to affect. It reduces cortisol, the stress hormone that in elevated chronic levels produces many of the symptoms that Hippocrates described. It stimulates the production of a protein called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which promotes the growth of new neural connections in the hippocampus, a brain region that shrinks in people with chronic depression and that responds to exercise by rebuilding itself. Hippocrates did not know about serotonin. He did not know about cortisol, or BDNF, or the hippocampus. He knew that when people who felt the way his patient felt started moving their bodies regularly, they tended to feel better. That observation, made without any of the tools of modern neuroscience, was correct. It has been confirmed by more clinical trials than almost any other intervention in the history of mental health treatment. A 2018 meta-analysis covering more than 1 million people found that regular physical exercise was associated with a 43% reduction in poor mental health days. Multiple randomized controlled trials have found that aerobic exercise is as effective as antidepressant medication for mild to moderate depression, with lower rates of relapse in the exercise group after treatment ends. Hippocrates was right. He was right for the wrong reasons, but he was right. The Romans understood something similar, but expressed it differently. The Roman approach to the body and its connection to mental state was embedded in the culture of the bath. Roman baths, the thermae, were not primarily about hygiene in the way that modern people use the word. They were social institutions of extraordinary sophistication, designed to produce specific physical and psychological effects through the systematic application of heat, cold, water, massage, and social interaction. The typical Roman bath experience moved through a sequence of rooms with increasing temperature. you began in the tepidarium, the warm room, which prepared the body gradually. You moved to the caldarium, the hot room, where you sweated extensively. Then you plunged into the frigidarium, the cold room, often with a cold pool that produced an immediate and dramatic physiological shock. This sequence, heat followed by cold immersion, is now understood to produce specific neurobiological effects that are relevant to depression. Cold water immersion activates the sympathetic nervous system, produces a surge of norepinephrine, and activates the vagus nerve, which is increasingly understood as a critical pathway in the regulation of mood. Modern cold water therapy, which has attracted significant research attention in recent years, is producing results that suggest the Romans were doing something genuinely effective every time they plunged into their cold pools. They did not know about the vagus nerve. They knew that people who used the baths regularly felt better. The social dimension of the Roman bath amplified its effects. You did not go to the thermae alone and sit in silence. You went with friends. You talked. You argued about politics and philosophy and the chariot races. You conducted business. You ate. You played games. The bath was simultaneously a physical treatment and a social occasion, and the combination produced something that neither element could produce alone. Social connection is now understood to be one of the most powerful protective factors against depression. Isolation is one of the strongest predictors of depressive episodes. The Romans, by embedding their physical health practices in a richly social context, were addressing both the neurobiological and the social dimensions of mental suffering simultaneously, without having any theoretical framework that would have allowed them to articulate why this was a good idea. They just knew it felt better to be there with other people. That was enough. The ancient Chinese approach to the body and depression was perhaps the most systematically developed of any ancient culture. Traditional Chinese medicine's understanding of stagnant qi led to a set of physical practices designed specifically to get energy moving again. These included what we would now call qigong and tai chi. Slow, deliberate movement sequences combined with specific breathing patterns and focused attention, designed to circulate energy through the body's pathways and break up the stagnation associated with depressive states. Modern research on these practices has produced results that are difficult to dismiss. A 2019 systematic review of studies on Tai Chi and Qigong found consistent evidence of significant reductions in depressive symptoms across multiple populations. The mechanisms appear to involve the combination of gentle aerobic activity, controlled breathing, focused attention, and the meditative quality of slow, deliberate movement, each of which independently produces measurable effects on the neurochemistry of mood. The ancient Chinese practitioners were not studying neurochemistry. They were watching what happened to people who did these practices regularly. They were watching the stagnation break up, the energy begin to move, the person gradually re-engage with the world around them. And they were recording what they saw, generation after generation, building a body of observational evidence that was, in its own way, as rigorous as a clinical trial, because it was conducted across millions of people over thousands of years. and the practices that did not produce consistent results were gradually dropped, and the ones that did were retained and refined. Time was the filter, and the practices that survived millennia of that filter were, almost without exception, practices that modern science has found mechanisms to explain. Sleep was another intervention that ancient physicians took seriously in ways that modern medicine is only now beginning to fully appreciate. Hippocrates wrote about sleep disturbance as both a symptom and a cause of melancholia. He noted that patients who could not sleep became worse, and that restoring normal sleep patterns was a critical component of recovery. The Egyptian medical texts described specific preparations of herbs, including what appears to be lettuce, which contains compounds with mild sedative properties, intended to restore healthy sleep patterns in people experiencing what sounds like depressive episodes with significant insomnia. The ancient world did not know about sleep architecture, or REM cycles, or the glymphatic system that cleans the brain during deep sleep, or the relationship between sleep deprivation and the dysregulation of the prefrontal cortex that produces the cognitive symptoms of depression. But they knew that when people with melancholia could not sleep, they got worse. And they knew that finding ways to help them sleep was part of the treatment. These observations, accumulated across millennia of watching people suffer and watching what helped them suffer less, constitute a kind of empirical knowledge that does not require theoretical understanding to be valid. You do not need to know why exercise helps to know that it helps. You do not need to understand the vagus nerve to know that cold water, followed by warmth and social contact, makes people feel better. You do not need to know about serotonin to notice that people who move their bodies regularly are less likely to stay stuck in the grey weight that makes life feel impossible. You need to pay attention. You need to record what you see. You need to pass it on. The ancient physicians were doing all three, imperfectly, within frameworks that were wrong in their explanations, but right in their observations, making mistakes and occasionally causing harm, and sometimes, across the noise of all their wrong theories, hitting something so precisely correct that it would take modern science 2,000 years to explain why. The body was not separate from the mind. It never was. The ancient physicians knew this. They knew it before they had the language to say it. They knew it in their hands, in the observations they made, in the treatments they prescribed and watched work, and passed on to their students, who passed them on to theirs. The body was always the way in. It still is. There is a story in the Bible, in the first book of Kings, about a man named Elijah. Elijah was a prophet, a powerful one, a man who had done extraordinary things and who was, by any external measure, successful and significant and alive with purpose. And then, one day, he sat down under a tree and asked to die. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that invited argument or consolation. He simply sat down and said that he had had enough and wanted it to be over. This description, written approximately 3,000 years ago, is one of the most precise accounts of a specific kind of depressive collapse in all of ancient literature. The collapse that comes not from failure, but from exhaustion. Not from losing, but from winning too many times at too high a cost. The particular darkness that arrives after the effort has been made and the goal has been achieved, and the person looks at what they have accomplished and feels, inexplicably and devastatingly, nothing. What happened next is interesting. An angel did not deliver a sermon about the importance of positive thinking. There was no exhortation to be grateful for his blessings, no suggestion that his feelings were disproportionate or that other people had it worse. The angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." There was food, there was water. He ate, he slept. The angel came back and said, "Get up and eat, because the journey is too long for you." He ate again, he slept again, and then he got up. Not because the darkness had been argued away, or prayed away, or ritually expelled, because someone had fed him and let him sleep. This story has been read for 3,000 years primarily as a religious text, as a narrative about divine care and prophetic mission. It is that, but it is also, embedded within its theological framework, an extraordinarily accurate description of what a person in the depths of depressive collapse actually needs from the people around them. Not explanation, not exhortation, not theology. Food, rest, presence. The basic physical needs met without judgment by someone who did not demand that the suffering person justify their suffering or perform recovery before they were ready. This is what modern crisis intervention specialists are trained to do. The angel was doing it 3,000 years ago. The ancient world was not, on the whole, a world that understood depression as a medical condition requiring treatment. But it was a world built on community in a way that modern societies are not. And that community structure provided, accidentally and incidentally, many of the things that people in depressive states most need. You could not be isolated in the ancient world in the way that modern people can be isolated. The practical structure of ancient life made isolation nearly impossible. In ancient Rome, most people lived in apartment buildings called insulae, multi-story structures that housed dozens of families in close proximity. You shared walls with your neighbors. You shared courtyards. You shared water sources. Your daily life was conducted in public, in the streets and the forums and the markets, because most apartments were too small and too dark to do anything in except sleep. Your suffering was not private. It could not be private. The neighbor heard you. The family saw you. The community noticed when you stopped appearing at the places where you were expected to appear. This had disadvantages. Privacy is genuinely valuable, and its absence is genuinely costly. But for people in depressive states, the forced social contact of ancient communal living meant that the withdrawal that depression produces, the pulling back from engagement with the world, had natural limits. You could withdraw somewhat. You could not disappear entirely. The community would notice, and the community would respond, not always helpfully, not always with understanding, but with presence. Presence matters. Modern research on depression consistently identifies social isolation as one of the most dangerous features of the condition, not just a symptom, but an amplifier that makes every other symptom worse. The removal of social contact removes the external feedback that helps a person maintain their sense of reality, their sense of their own value, their connection to the ongoing flow of life that depression tries to cut them off from. The ancient world's community structures provided this feedback automatically, not intentionally, not as a mental health intervention, as a byproduct of the simple fact that people lived on top of each other and could not avoid being witnessed. Music was another communal resource that ancient cultures mobilized against psychological suffering, and the sophistication of their understanding of music's effects on mood is remarkable. The story of David and Saul in the Hebrew Bible describes Saul, who appears to suffer from severe depressive or possibly psychotic episodes, being treated by David's harp playing. The text is specific about the mechanism. When the evil spirit came upon Saul, David would play, and Saul would be relieved and feel better. This was not considered miraculous. It was considered a known effect of music, reliable enough to be prescribed deliberately, specific enough that David was recruited specifically for his musical skill as a treatment for a specific condition. The Greeks theorized about music's effects with characteristic systematic thoroughness. Different musical modes, different scales and rhythms and emotional qualities were understood to produce different psychological effects. The Dorian mode was considered stabilizing and calming. The Phrygian mode was considered exciting and potentially destabilizing. The Lydian mode was considered relaxing to the point of enervation. These distinctions were not just aesthetic preferences. They were medical prescriptions. Specific modes were recommended for specific conditions. A person in a state of agitation needed different music than a person in a state of depression. The physician or philosopher who recommended music as treatment was expected to specify not just that music should be used, but which kind, in what context, for how long. Modern music therapy, which has accumulated substantial research support as an intervention for depression and anxiety, is working with mechanisms that the Greeks were observing empirically more than 2,000 years ago. The mechanisms involve multiple pathways. Music activates the dopaminergic reward system, producing genuine neurobiological pleasure. It synchronizes brain oscillations in ways that promote emotional regulation. It provides a structured emotional experience that can help people process feelings that are too diffuse or overwhelming to approach directly. Shared music, music experienced in community, adds social bonding effects that amplify all of these individual benefits. The Greeks knew the last part intuitively. Greek music was almost never a solitary experience. It was communal, performed at festivals and religious ceremonies and symposia, experienced together by people whose shared emotional response to the music created bonds between them that were, in some ways, more intimate than ordinary social interaction. You could sit next to someone for years without truly knowing them. You could weep together at the same passage of music and know something essential about each other in an instant. This knowing, this sudden recognition of shared inner experience was understood as healing, not as a metaphor, as a literal therapeutic mechanism. The person who had been suffering in the private darkness of their own skull suddenly discovered that the darkness was not private, that the person next to them knew it too, that the music had made visible something that was usually invisible, the shared vulnerability of the human interior, the universal experience of suffering that depression always tries to convince you is uniquely and shamefully yours. It is not yours. It has never been yours. It belongs to everyone. And the ancient world, for all its wrong theories and cruel treatments and fundamental misunderstanding of the brain, understood this one thing with a clarity that modern individualistic culture sometimes loses. Suffering is not a private problem. It is a communal experience, and the community's response to it, the food and the presence and the music and the simple fact of being witnessed, is not charity extended to the weak. It is the most important thing a community does. It is, in many ways, the reason communities exist at all. Marcus Aurelius was one of the most powerful men who ever lived. He ruled the Roman Empire at its height. He commanded armies. He decided the fates of millions of people with the stroke of a pen. He had access to every material comfort that the ancient world could provide, every food and luxury and entertainment and distraction that wealth and power could purchase. And every morning, before he did anything else, he sat down and wrote about how hard it was to get out of bed. Not metaphorically, literally. The opening pages of what we now call the Meditations, the private journal that Marcus Aurelius kept for himself and never intended to be published, described the internal argument he had with himself every morning when he woke up and did not want to face the day. He wrote about the voice that said, "Stay in bed. It is warm here. The world out there is cold and difficult and full of people who will disappoint you, and problems that cannot be solved, and suffering that cannot be prevented." He wrote about what he said back to the voice. Not that the voice was wrong. Not that the world was actually warm and easy and full of people who would not disappoint him. He did not argue with the content of the voice. He argued with its conclusion. Yes, he wrote, the world is hard. Yes, the people are difficult. Yes, the problems are real and the suffering is real, and none of it is going to get easier just because you stayed in bed. But you were not made for ease. You were made for this. Get up. This internal dialogue, preserved in a private journal written 2,000 years ago, is structurally identical to a technique used in modern cognitive behavioral therapy called behavioral activation. The technique is based on research showing that one of the most effective ways to interrupt a depressive episode is to act against the behavioral withdrawal that depression produces, to do the thing that needs to be done, even when every part of you insists that you cannot, because the doing itself changes the feeling in ways that waiting for the feeling to change first never will. Marcus Aurelius was not familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy. He was familiar with Stoic philosophy, which had been developing for about 400 years by the time he was writing, and which had, over those 400 years, constructed a set of mental practices for dealing with psychological suffering that were remarkably sophisticated and remarkably effective. The Stoics began with an observation that sounds simple and is not. They observed that most human suffering is not caused by external events. It is caused by the judgments we make about external events. The event happens. The judgment follows automatically, so fast that it feels like part of the event itself. But the judgment is not the event. The judgment is something we add to the event, and the judgment can be examined and, with practice, changed. This is the foundational insight of cognitive therapy, stated by Aaron Beck in the 1960s, which is why cognitive therapy is sometimes described as a rediscovery of Stoicism dressed in clinical language. Beck did not hide this connection. He acknowledged it explicitly. The Stoics had identified the mechanism that cognitive therapy is based on more than 2,000 years before cognitive therapy existed as a formal discipline. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who was born into slavery and who understood from personal experience what it meant to have no control over the external circumstances of his life, made this observation with particular sharpness. "Some things are in our power," he wrote. "Some things are not. What is in our power is our judgment, our impulse, our desire, our aversion. These things are ours. They belong to us. They can be worked on, trained, developed, improved. What is not in our power is everything else. The body's health, external wealth, other people's opinions, the outcome of events we have set in motion. These things are not ours. They were never ours. The suffering that comes from trying to control them comes from the mistaken belief that they could be controlled. The practice Epictetus recommended was the systematic examination of every source of distress to determine whether it fell in the first category or the second. Is this thing in my power? If yes, work on it. If no, release it. Not because releasing it is easy, because holding it is the source of the suffering. And the suffering is not improving the situation. And the practice of release is a skill that can be developed, like any other skill, through deliberate practice across time. This is exactly what modern acceptance and commitment therapy, one of the most empirically supported treatments for depression available today, teaches its patients to do. The Stoics were teaching it in Athens and Rome 2,000 years earlier. Buddhism, developing roughly simultaneously on the other side of the world, arrived at similar conclusions through a different path. The Buddha's first teaching, delivered in a deer park outside the city of Varanasi approximately 2,500 years ago, began with a statement that has been translated in various ways, but whose core content is consistent across translations. Life contains suffering. Suffering has a cause. The cause can be addressed. There is a path for addressing it. The cause that the Buddha identified was attachment. Specifically, the attachment to outcomes, to things, to states of being, to the idea that things should be different from how they are. The suffering came not from the circumstances, but from the gap between the circumstances and the desperate wish that they were otherwise. This is not identical to the Stoic position, but it is closely related. Both traditions identified the human tendency to fight against reality as a primary source of psychological suffering. Both recommended practices designed to reduce this fighting. Both understood that the practices required sustained effort and that the effort was worthwhile. Buddhist meditation practices, developed over 2,500 years as technologies for examining and working with the mind, are now among the most extensively researched psychological interventions in existence. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which combines Buddhist meditation techniques with cognitive behavioral therapy, has been approved by health systems in multiple countries as a treatment for recurrent depression specifically. The research is substantial. The effects are measurable. The mechanisms are increasingly understood. And they are the mechanisms that Buddhist monks were working with in monasteries across Asia for 2.5 millennia before the first clinical trial was designed. The ancient philosophical traditions were not just intellectual exercises. They were technologies, mental technologies, designed to address specific forms of human suffering through specific practices applied consistently over time. The Stoics had their morning reflection practice, their evening review, their deliberate contemplation of difficulty in advance, the practice called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, in which you imagined in advance the things you feared losing, so that when they were lost, or when they seemed about to be lost, the shock was smaller and the recovery faster. The Buddhists had their breath meditation, their loving-kindness practice, the systematic cultivation of compassion toward oneself and others, their body scan, the deliberate movement of attention through the physical sensations of the body as an anchor against the ruminative thought patterns that depression feeds on. The Stoics and Buddhists have never met each other. They were working in different languages, in different cultures, drawing on different intellectual traditions, addressing different audiences. And they built almost the same tools. Because they were addressing the same problem, the human mind turned against itself. The thoughts that loop, the feelings that solidify into facts, the conviction that the current state is permanent, and that the current suffering is the final truth about the world and about the self. Both traditions found, through centuries of careful observation of how minds work and what makes minds work better, that the loop can be interrupted. Not by force, not by willpower in the crude sense of simply deciding to feel better, but by attention, by the careful, disciplined, practiced redirection of attention away from the content of the loop and toward something else. The breath, the body, the present moment, the examination of the thought itself, not its content, but its nature, the recognition that the thought is a thought and not a fact. This sounds easy. It is not easy. Both traditions were explicit about this. The Stoics described it as lifelong work. The Buddhists described a path that took years of dedicated practice to walk even partially. But both traditions also agreed on something that is, ultimately, the most important thing either of them had to say about psychological suffering. It is workable. Whatever you are feeling right now, whatever loop you are caught in, whatever grey weight is sitting in your chest, it is not the final truth about you or about the world. It is a state. States change. The mind that produced this state can, with the right kind of attention, applied in the right kind of way, produce a different state. Not permanently, not perfectly, not by arriving at some final destination where suffering is impossible, but differently enough to matter, differently enough to live. Here is something that modern medicine knows and does not always say loudly enough. The most effective treatment for depression that currently exists is not a pill. It is not a specific form of therapy. It is not a medical procedure or a technological intervention or a pharmaceutical compound developed in the last 50 years. The most effective treatment for depression that currently exists is a combination of things: exercise, social connection, meaningful work, exposure to natural light, adequate sleep, the practices of attention and self-examination that help a person observe their own thoughts without being entirely consumed by them. Every single one of these things was known to the ancient world, not as a treatment for depression, because the word did not exist, as a description of a good human life. This is not a coincidence. It is the most important thing that the entire history of humanity's encounter with psychological suffering has to tell us. The things that protect against depression are not special interventions designed to fix a broken mind. They are the conditions under which the human mind was designed to operate. Movement, community, purpose, light, rest, attention. These are not treatments. They are requirements. The way water is a requirement and not a treatment for thirst. And the modern world, for all its extraordinary advances in medicine and technology and material comfort, has systematically removed most of these requirements from the daily lives of most people. We sit still for hours in artificial light, doing work that often feels disconnected from any tangible outcome, surrounded by people we are digitally connected to but physically isolated from, sleeping less than our biology requires, eating in ways that disrupt the neurochemistry that mood depends on, spending less time in natural environments than any previous generation of humans in history. And then we are surprised that rates of depression are rising. We should not be surprised. We have removed the conditions. We are experiencing the consequences. The ancient world was not a paradise of mental health. We have seen in this story the wrong theories and the harmful treatments, and the suffering that went unaddressed because the frameworks available could not see it clearly. The ancient world was harder and more painful and more dangerous than the modern one in ways that are real and significant and should not be romanticized. But the ancient world had, built into its daily structure, many of the things that the human mind needs to function well. Not because ancient people were wiser than modern people, because they had no choice. You had to move your body because there was no other way to get anywhere. You had to be in community because survival outside of community was impossible. You had to engage with meaningful work because the work was directly connected to whether you and the people you loved would eat. You had to be in natural light because there was no artificial alternative. You had to sleep because there was nothing to keep you awake after dark. The conditions were imposed by necessity. We have removed the necessity. And in removing the necessity, we have removed the protection. This is not an argument for returning to the ancient world. It is an argument for understanding what the ancient world had accidentally right, so that we can find ways to deliberately replicate it in the world we actually live in. The Stoics called this practice. The Buddhists called it the path. The Romans called it virtus, the active expression of human excellence. The Greeks called it eudaimonia, which is usually translated as happiness, but which means something closer to flourishing, the full and active expression of what a human being is capable of being. None of these traditions promised that practice would eliminate suffering. None of them were selling the idea that the right philosophy, or the right discipline, or the right way of living would make the grey weight in the chest disappear permanently and never return. They were selling something more realistic and more valuable. They were selling the idea that you are not helpless, that the mind is not a passive recipient of whatever states arrive in it, that there are things you can do, specific things, practiced consistently over time, that change the probability of the dark states arriving and reduce their duration when they do. Not a cure, a practice. The difference between a cure and a practice is important. A cure is something that happens to you. You receive it passively. It works or it does not. You are better or you are not. A practice is something you do. You engage it actively. It develops over time. You become, gradually, more skilled at it. The skill is yours. It cannot be taken away. It does not expire or become unavailable. The ancient traditions that dealt most effectively with psychological suffering, the Stoics and the Buddhists and the Confucians and the designers of the Asclepian, all understood their work as practice rather than cure. They were not trying to fix a broken mind. They were trying to train a mind that was functioning exactly as minds function, which is to say, imperfectly, painfully, with tendencies toward loops and rumination and the catastrophizing of present difficulty into permanent truth. They were training the mind to work with its own nature rather than against it. This is still the most honest and most effective description of what good mental health practice looks like. Not fighting the mind, working with it. There is one more thing that the ancient world understood about psychological suffering that the modern world sometimes loses in its entirely justified focus on the neuroscience and the pharmacology and the clinical frameworks. The ancient world understood that suffering is not meaningless. Not in the religious sense that suffering is good because it builds character or earns divine reward, though some ancient traditions said versions of this. In the more fundamental sense that the capacity for the kind of suffering we call depression is inseparable from the capacities that make human life most valuable. The same depth of feeling that makes the grey weight so heavy is the depth of feeling that makes love profound and beauty moving and connection real. The same sensitivity that makes you vulnerable to depressive states is the sensitivity that makes you capable of genuine empathy, of truly entering another person's experience rather than just observing it from outside. The same mind that loops and ruminates and catastrophizes is the mind that plans and imagines and creates and solves. You cannot have one without the other. The ancient traditions that worked most honestly with psychological suffering knew this. They did not promise to sand down the sharp edges of the mind that cut inward, because those same edges are what allows the mind to cut through to truth. The goal was never to produce a mind that did not suffer. The goal was to produce a person who could suffer without being destroyed by it, who could carry the weight without being flattened by it, who could sit under the tree exhausted and say, "I have had enough," and then eat and sleep and get up, not because the darkness was gone, because the journey, as the angel said to Elijah 3,000 years ago, is too long for you to make it without stopping to rest. Rest, eat, sleep, and then get up. That is the oldest advice in the world. It is also, when everything else has been tried and theorized and clinically tested and meta-analyzed and refined into the most sophisticated understanding of the human mind that has ever existed, still the most important. The journey is long. You are allowed to rest, and you are allowed to get up. You were built for both.